I took care of my sick father for 5 years while my siblings ignored him. But when he passed away, they all showed up demanding their fair share of his estate, even though they did nothing for him. For 5 long years, I put my life on hold to take care of my father. While my siblings carried on with their lives, I was the one by his side. Through every doctor's visit, every sleepless night, every difficult moment. I fed him, bathed him, made sure he had everything he needed. I wasn't just his child. I became his caretaker, his advocate, his only real support. And through it all, I never once heard from my siblings. No calls, no visits, no offers to help. It was as if he didn't exist to them. But then everything changed the moment he passed away. Suddenly my siblings, who had been nowhere to be found for years, came out of the woodwork. And they weren't there to grieve. They weren't there to mourn the man they had abandoned. No, they were there for one thing only. His estate. His house, his savings, anything of value. They spoke as if they had been devoted children, acting as if they had a rightful claim to everything he left behind. I stood there, listening to them argue over who should get what, as if my father was just a name on a bank account. It was infuriating. I had sacrificed everything for him, my time, my energy, my own well-being, while they lived their lives without a care in the world. And now they expected me to just hand over what they thought was their fair share? I felt a storm of emotions, anger, betrayal, disbelief. But deep down I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let them walk all over me. Not after everything I had been through. Not after everything my father had been through. So I made a choice. A choice that would change everything. And let's just say, my siblings weren't expecting what happened next. The months leading up to my father's passing were some of the hardest of my life. It wasn't just his illness, it was everything that came with it. The late-night emergency room visits, the constant calls to doctors who couldn't seem to offer any answers, and the overwhelming exhaustion that came from caring for someone who couldn't take care of themselves. Some days I felt like I was drowning, and there were moments when I wondered why I was the one doing all of this, while my siblings just carried on with their normal lives, without so much as a glance in my direction. You see, I wasn't always the one who took on the role of caretaker. Growing up, my family was like any other. We were close-knit, and my father was the center of everything. But when his health began to decline, that's when everything shifted. My brother, the oldest, was always too busy with his job to even think about what was going on at home. My sister, the youngest, was living out of state and had her own family to look after. And then there was me, stuck in the middle. I lived nearby, and somehow it just made sense that I'd take on the responsibility. But what no one told me was how isolating that would feel. First, I didn't mind. I loved my father and I wanted to make sure he was comfortable. But as the years went on, the resentment started to build. It wasn't the physical work that wore me down. It was the emotional toll. No one ever asked if I needed help. No one offered to pitch in, not even once. I was the one who watched my father lose his strength, his dignity, and his will to fight. I was the one who had to make decisions that no child should ever have to make, from managing his medical bills to making sure he had everything he needed at home. And as my father's health continued to worsen, I couldn't help but feel abandoned by the very people who should have been there for him, and for me. My siblings, I now realize, had always been good at avoiding responsibility. It was as if they had decided that it was easier to just pretend that everything was fine, rather than face the reality of what was happening. I would call them with updates about Dad's condition, but it was always the same story. "I'm too busy right now," they'd say. "Maybe next time." Next time never came. And every time they brushed me off, I felt a little more alone, a little more resentful. When my father's health took a turn for the worse and he was put on hospice care, it was as if my entire world had crumbled. I could see the end coming, but I couldn't bring myself to accept it. There were so many things left unsaid, so many things I wanted to make right. But I knew deep down that the time for that was running out. Still, I carried on. I kept the house running, made sure Dad was as comfortable as possible, and took care of the little things, everything my siblings had refused to do. The day he passed away was almost a relief, but that didn't make it any easier. In some strange way, I felt as though I had lost a part of myself too. All those years of sacrifice, all those sleepless nights, all those quiet moments when I wondered if anyone would ever notice. It all hit me at once. I wasn't just mourning the loss of my father. I was mourning the years I'd lost, the relationship with my siblings that had crumbled, and the parts of myself that had been sacrificed along the way. When my father passed, I did everything the way I thought he would have wanted. I arranged the funeral, handled the legal paperwork, and made sure everything was taken care of. I was doing what I had always done, taking care of things. And then, just as the dust began to settle, my siblings showed up, one by one. It started with my brother. He called me 2 days after the funeral, asking if I had figured out the estate yet. I was still reeling from the loss, still trying to keep it all together, and here he was, wanting to talk about the house, the money, the inheritance. I remember feeling a strange mixture of anger and disbelief. Did he really think that after all these years, I would just hand over everything as if nothing had happened? But I didn't say anything. Instead, I told him I needed time to sort through everything. He didn't like that answer, but I didn't care. Then came my sister. She called a week later, telling me that she had just been too busy to help out during Dad's illness. But now that he was gone, she wanted to make sure that she got what she was owed. Owed? I almost dropped the phone when she said that. Owed? She hadn't been there. She hadn't done a thing. But as I listened to her, I could hear the entitlement in her voice, the same voice that had been absent for years. She didn't care that I had given up everything for Dad. She didn't care that I had been the one to hold it all together. She just wanted what she thought was hers. And that's when the real tension started. My brother and sister weren't the only ones who had something to say. My other siblings, cousins, and distant relatives, all of them began to chime in. It seemed like everyone suddenly had a say in what happened to my father's estate, even though they had been nowhere to be found while he was alive. The phone calls, the texts, the emails, they came flooding in, each one demanding a piece of something that wasn't theirs to take. I tried to stay calm. I tried to remind myself that they were grieving too, but it was hard. I had been the one who had lived through the last 5 years of my father's life. I had been the one to deal with the sickness, the decline, and the final days. And now I had to sit back and watch as they tried to claim what they hadn't earned. It was like they thought I owed them something, like I was somehow obligated to hand over everything I had fought for. But I wasn't going to let it happen. I wasn't going to let them bulldoze me like they always had. This time I was going to stand my ground, and I wasn't going to let them take what wasn't theirs. But the real question was, how far would I have to go to protect what was rightfully mine, and my father's? And what would happen when the truth about the estate started to unfold? Would they accept it, or would it tear the family apart once and for all? The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Each day my siblings seemed to have more demands, more expectations, as if they had some right to what was left after my father passed away. They never asked how I was coping, how I was managing the overwhelming grief and the responsibility of sorting through his belongings. It was as if they thought they could just waltz in and take what they believed they were owed, with no regard for the 5 years of my life I had given up to care for him. I couldn't stop myself from replaying all the moments when I had begged for help. I had called, emailed, and even sent messages asking them to come help, to take over for a few hours so I could get some rest. But they never responded. It was always some excuse. I'm too busy, I have work, I have my own family to take care of. And now, when the hard part was over and my father was gone, they thought they could just waltz in and claim what they thought was theirs. The tension in the family grew worse with every conversation. It wasn't just the inheritance. It was the years of resentment and anger that had built up during those lonely, exhausting years of caregiving. I couldn't shake the feeling that they saw me as some sort of doormat, someone who would just roll over and do whatever they demanded, just like I had always done. But this time I wasn't going to let that happen. One evening, after another phone call from my brother about how he needed his fair share, I snapped. I hadn't realized how much I had been holding in until the words came rushing out. You didn't help him. You didn't take care of him when he needed you the most. I said, my voice shaking with frustration. And now you want to take everything from me? There was a long silence on the other end of the line before he spoke, and when he did, his tone was cold. I was busy. We all have lives. But that doesn't mean I don't deserve a piece of what Dad left behind. His words felt like a slap to my face, as if he was trying to justify his absence for years with a simple claim to what my father had worked for. The whole conversation felt like a slap in the face, and I ended the call before I could say anything I might regret. But that night I couldn't sleep. I kept turning it over in my mind, thinking about all the sacrifices I had made. All the nights I stayed up beside my father's bed when I could have been doing anything else. And the more I thought about it, the more determined I became. They couldn't just take what wasn't theirs. I wouldn't let them. As the days went on, I realized I wasn't the only one struggling with the inheritance. My sister, the youngest of the three, had been the quiet one in all of this. She hadn't called much after Dad passed, but I knew she was watching everything unfold from a distance. Her husband had called me twice, once asking about the estate and another time wondering when the will would be read. His tone, just like my brother's, was demanding, as if they had a right to all of it. But she hadn't made any moves yet, and I wasn't sure what she was waiting for. I hadn't heard from my sister for days, but one evening, she showed up at my doorstep unannounced. I didn't know what to expect, but the moment I saw her standing there with a hesitant look on her face, I felt a tight knot in my stomach. "Can we talk?" she asked, and I nodded, unsure of what was coming next. We sat in the living room, and for the first time in a long time it felt like we were actually talking, really talking. She didn't apologize for not being there for Dad, but she did express how overwhelmed she felt. She told me she had always seen me as the strong one, the one who could handle everything, and she admitted she had never known how to help. Her voice cracked when she said it, as though there were a vulnerability she had never shared before. I listened, but part of me couldn't shake the anger that bubbled up. Where had this side of her been all these years? Why had she stayed away, only to show up now, acting like she had any claim to what Dad left behind? "I just want my fair share," she finally said, her voice soft but determined. "I don't want to fight about this. But I don't want to be left out either." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. She wasn't here to mourn, not really. She wasn't here to comfort me, to help me sort through my grief. She was here for one thing only, her share of the estate. And I couldn't understand how they could all think they had any right to it after doing nothing for years. Days turned into weeks, and the tension only grew. My brother continued calling, sending messages, and even showing up at my door to demand updates. My sister started pushing harder, talking to our relatives and trying to rally support for her side. The entire situation was turning into something I hadn't expected, something that threatened to tear our family apart. But it wasn't just about the estate anymore. It was about something deeper. The years of neglect, the years of me taking the burden while they stayed far away, came rushing back with every conversation. I could feel the old wounds reopening, and I wasn't sure how to close them again. It wasn't just the inheritance that was at stake. It was the very fabric of our family. The relationships that had been shattered over the years, the trust that had been lost. And as each day passed, I realized that I had to make a choice. I had to decide whether I was going to continue playing the role of the dutiful daughter, the one who always did what was expected, or if I was finally going to stand up for myself and take control of what was mine. But how far would I be willing to go to protect what I had? How far would I go to keep my siblings from taking what wasn't theirs? And most of all, how could I hold my family together when it seemed like everything was falling apart? The answer was still unclear, but one thing was certain. This battle was far from over. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm that was just about to break. Each time my siblings called, I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me. It wasn't just about the estate anymore. It was about everything they had taken from me. The years of my life spent caring for our father, the emotional and physical toll it had taken, the sacrifices that no one seemed to understand. They all acted as though I was just supposed to hand over whatever they thought they deserved, without any consideration for the years of my life I had given up for our family. One afternoon, as I was going through my father's things, trying to sort through the mess he'd left behind, I got a call from my brother. He was demanding as usual, but this time, his tone was more forceful. He said, "You need to stop dragging this out. Dad wouldn't have wanted this. We have every right to what he left." Something in me snapped. How dare he say that? How dare they all act like they were entitled to everything after they'd abandoned him when he needed them most? I had spent years holding everything together, being the one to deal with the doctors, the bills, the late-night calls, the emotional roller coaster. And now they wanted to come in and act like they were the ones who deserved it all? I slammed the phone down, heart pounding, fists clenched. The more I thought about it, the more furious I became. But I knew I had to stay calm. I had to think this through. What was the next move? What could I do to stop them from getting away with this? That night as I lay in bed, my mind wouldn't stop racing. I kept thinking about what my sister had said. She didn't want to fight, she just wanted her fair share. But what was fair? Was it fair that they'd all neglected our father when he needed them, and now they wanted to take what he had left? Was it fair that they wanted to act like they had any claim to anything when I had been the one to care for him, to watch over him, to make sure he wasn't alone in his final days? The more I thought about it, the more it became clear. They didn't care about fairness. They cared about what they could get, what they thought they were owed. And I wasn't about to let them take it without a fight. I knew I had to do something drastic. If I didn't, they would continue to push, continue to demand, and I'd be left with nothing. But what could I do? What would it take to make them understand how wrong they were? The next morning, I got a message from my sister, asking to meet up. She said she wanted to talk about things. I didn't know what to expect, but I agreed. Part of me hoped she would finally see things my way, but deep down, I knew it was going to be another conversation about how much they deserved. Still, I couldn't just ignore it. We met at a cafe, and as soon as she sat down, I could tell she was nervous. She kept fidgeting with her napkin, not meeting my eyes. Finally, she spoke up, her voice quieter than usual. I know things have been difficult, but I really think we need to figure this out. We can't keep going like this. I nodded, my heart racing. I didn't know where this conversation was going, but I knew it was going to be important. What are you saying? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, trying to keep the anger in check. I don't want to fight, she said, still not meeting my eyes. But I think it's time we talk about Dad's will. We need to make sure everything's fair. I don't want to be left with nothing. Her words felt like a slap in the face. How could she still be focused on this? Didn't she see how much I had given up? I clenched my fists under the table, trying to hold back the words that were threatening to spill out. Fair? You think this is about fair? I asked, my voice rising despite myself. You want fairness? Where were you when Dad needed help? Where were you when I was the one taking care of him, day in and day out? She flinched at my words, and for the first time, she seemed to understand the depth of my anger. But then she looked up at me, her eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before. Guilt, maybe. I'm sorry. I don't know what to say. I didn't know how hard it was for you. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. This was it, the moment where things could go one of two ways. I could let the anger take over, and we could fight this out until it tore the family apart. Or I could try to make her understand, try to get her to see that what they were asking for wasn't just unfair. It was downright wrong. You don't understand, I said quietly, looking her in the eye. I've been carrying this weight for 5 years. I've been the one who gave up everything for him. I don't know what your idea of fair is, but it's not about just dividing up what's left. It's about respect. It's about what's right. She didn't answer right away. She just sat there staring at me, her face unreadable. And in that moment, I realized that I wasn't sure what would happen next. I didn't know if she would finally understand, if she would stand with me, or if she would continue to side with the others, demanding her fair share. But one thing was clear, the battle was far from over. And as much as I wanted to believe it could be resolved peacefully, I had a sinking feeling that things were only going to get more complicated from here. I left the cafe that day with a sense of uncertainty hanging over me. My sister's apology didn't bring the closure I was hoping for. In fact, it only left me with more questions. Could she really understand the extent of my sacrifice? Or was she just saying what she thought would appease me? I couldn't trust her words, not yet, not after everything. The next few days were a blur of tense phone calls and messages. My siblings seemed to be coming out of the woodwork, each one claiming a right to a piece of the estate, each one more insistent than the last. It felt like a constant barrage of demands, with little to no acknowledgement of the years I'd spent caring for our father. Every time they called, I could hear the entitlement in their voices, the expectation that I would just roll over and let them take what they wanted. But there was something off about the whole situation. It was too convenient, too organized. It wasn't just about the money or the property. There was something deeper at play, and I was starting to sense it. One night, as I was going through my father's old paperwork, I came across something unexpected. A letter. It was folded neatly and tucked away in a corner of his desk drawer, as though it had been intentionally hidden. I hesitated, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. The letter was dated just a few weeks before his death, and the handwriting was unmistakable, my father's. As I read, the words hit me like a punch to the gut. In the letter, my father expressed regret over the way his estate was being divided. He mentioned that he had made some questionable decisions in the past, especially when it came to his children. But the most shocking part of the letter was what came next. He had written that he wanted to leave everything to me, to make sure I was taken care of for all the years I had devoted to him. He had also made arrangements for the rest of the estate to be given to a charity that helped families in need, something I knew he had always wanted to do. My heart raced as I processed the words. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for, the moment that could change everything. But the more I thought about it, the more questions came to mind. Why had my father kept this letter a secret? Why hadn't he told anyone about these plans? And what did this mean for the estate that my siblings were now fighting for? The tension between me and my siblings had been building for weeks, but now it felt like everything was about to explode. I couldn't just sit back and let them think they had any claim to what was rightfully mine. But I also knew that this letter, if it were to come to light, could throw everything into chaos. I wasn't sure who I could trust anymore. My sister had apologized, but could she really be on my side? Could my other siblings even begin to understand the weight of what was happening? And then there was the charity, my father's wish to donate his estate to something meaningful. If I went public with this letter, I would be going against their wishes. But if I didn't, would I be letting them get away with taking what they hadn't earned? The decision weighed on me, each option more fraught with consequences than the last. But before I could even begin to process what I should do next, another bombshell dropped. The next morning I received a call from a lawyer I didn't recognize. He informed me that there had been a recent change in the will. At first I thought it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. But when he mentioned my father's name, and the specific details of his estate, I knew something was terribly wrong. According to the lawyer, my father had made a new will just days before his death, and it contradicted everything that had been laid out in the letter I found. The lawyer explained that the new will left the majority of the estate to my siblings, with only a small portion allocated to me. He said the changes were legally binding and had been witnessed by my father's attorney. I felt the blood drain from my face as the words sank in. Had my father been coerced into changing his will? Had my siblings found a way to manipulate him into making a decision he might not have wanted? Or had he truly changed his mind in those final days? And more importantly, what was I supposed to do now? How could I fight against something that was legally official? I hung up the phone, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. The world around me seemed to tilt. Everything I thought I knew about my father and his wishes crumbling into dust. Was this some kind of game they had been playing all along? Had they known about the will change? Had they been manipulating me from the start, pushing me into a corner where I had no choice but to accept their demands? The pieces didn't add up, and the more I tried to make sense of it all, the more the mystery deepened. This wasn't just about money or property anymore. It was about control, about power. And it seemed like my siblings were ready to stop at nothing to get what they wanted. I had to make a choice. I could either fight back with everything I had, risking everything in the process, or I could walk away and let them have what they thought they were owed. But something told me that no matter what I chose, this wasn't over yet. The storm was far from calm, and I had a feeling that the biggest twist of all was still yet to come. I had reached my breaking point. The legal battle was heating up, and I couldn't keep up with the endless back and forth. My siblings were relentless, using every legal loophole they could find, trying to manipulate the system in their favor. But I wasn't going to let them win. Not after everything I had done for our father. I gathered all the documents I could find, the letter he had written, the old will, and the supposed new one. My heart was pounding in my chest as I called a trusted lawyer, one who had been a family friend for years. I couldn't trust the lawyers my siblings had hired. I needed someone who understood me, who understood our family's history, and what my father would have wanted. The lawyer agreed to meet with me, and together we went through everything. Slowly, the truth began to unravel. It wasn't just that my siblings had manipulated our father in his final days. It was worse than that. The so-called new will wasn't legally binding at all. In fact, it had been forged. The lawyer dug into the details and discovered that my siblings had somehow gotten their hands on the original will after my father passed away. They had used his signature from an old document, one that had been left in a drawer, to create a fraudulent will. They had hoped that I would never find out. But I did. Armed with this knowledge, I confronted them. It was time to expose the truth. I gathered all the evidence, met with a private investigator, and pieced together their entire scheme. The fraud, the manipulation, everything. I couldn't believe how far they had gone to rob me of what was rightfully mine. And worst of all, to dishonor my father's true wishes. When I finally showed up at the meeting with my siblings, the atmosphere was thick with tension. I could see the shock on their faces as I presented the evidence. They tried to deny it, but there was no escaping the facts. The forged will was out in the open, and they had no choice but to face the consequences. But just as I thought the nightmare was over, something even more shocking happened. As I was about to sign the legal documents to reclaim my rightful share of the estate, I received a call from the lawyer. I could hear the panic in his voice. He told me there was one last piece of the puzzle I hadn't seen yet. One final twist that would change everything. It turned out that my father had made an even more secretive change to his will, one that had never been found until now. Deep inside his safe, alongside the other important documents, there was a final version of his will, one that he had kept hidden even from his closest friends and family. This will not only left everything to me but also stated that my siblings, who had tried to deceive me, were to receive nothing. It was a jaw-dropping revelation. My father had known. He had known that they would try to take advantage of him, and he had taken steps to protect me in his final days. The very people who had tried to tear me down were now exposed for who they truly were. In that moment, a mix of emotions flooded over me. Relief, anger, sadness. My father had been wise in his final decisions, but I couldn't help but feel betrayed by the family I had once loved. The will, the secrets, the lies, it was all too much to process. As the final legal proceedings wrapped up, my siblings were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered plans. They had tried to take everything from me, but in the end they had lost it all. Their greed had led them down a path from which there was no return. But just when I thought I could finally breathe easy, I found something else. Something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Hidden among the final papers was a letter from my father. It wasn't addressed to me, but to my siblings. In the letter, my father wrote of his deep regret for how things had turned out. He acknowledged his flaws, his failures as a parent, and how he wished he had been able to repair the relationship with them before it was too late. But the most chilling part of the letter was the final sentence. I only hope that my death will bring peace, but I fear it will only drive them further apart. I stared at the letter, my heart heavy with a mixture of anger and sorrow. My father had known. He had known that the family he left behind would never be the same. He had tried to make things right, but in the end all his efforts had been in vain. As I closed the envelope and sat there in silence, I couldn't help but wonder. Was there any real resolution to this story? My siblings would pay for their greed, but would the damage to our family ever truly heal? Or had my father been right all along? Had his death not brought peace but only deeper division? I couldn't answer those questions. All I knew was that, in the end, I had fought for what was rightfully mine, and somehow I had come out on top. But at what cost? The family I had once known was gone, and the only thing left was the bitter taste of betrayal. As I sat in that quiet room reflecting on everything that had transpired, I realized that the battle wasn't just about the estate or the money. It was about the relationships we had lost along the way. My siblings had been blinded by greed, but it had cost them the one thing they could never get back, the bond of family. I had fought for what was mine, but in doing so I had also lost the family I once knew. The legal case was finally over, and the estate was settled. I received what my father had intended, but the road to get there had been long and painful. I had no satisfaction in seeing my siblings exposed for their deceit. It felt more like a hollow victory. There was no joy in it. My father's legacy wasn't about money or possessions. It was about the love and care he had once shown to all of us. But by the end, those values had been lost in the greed and bitterness that consumed my siblings. After everything was settled, I found myself standing alone in my father's old house. It was strange to be there without him. The walls that once echoed with laughter and warmth now felt cold and empty. But then, something unexpected happened. My youngest sibling, the one who had seemed the most detached from everything, reached out. They apologized. It wasn't much, but it was a start. We talked for hours, sharing memories of our father, reflecting on what we had all lost. It wasn't a perfect resolution. The damage to our family couldn't be undone with a simple conversation, but it was a beginning. And sometimes that's all you can ask for: closure. My siblings, though still fractured, began to rebuild their lives, each in their own way. Some chose to move far away, while others remained close to the family home. But the bitterness that once dominated our interactions began to fade. I realized that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones fought within our own families. The greed, the anger, and the unresolved issues can tear us apart, but it's up to us to decide whether we allow them to define us. In the end, I had learned the true value of love, sacrifice, and the importance of standing up for what is right. My father may have left this world, but his lessons lived on in me, and that was the most valuable inheritance of all. The house was quiet now, but as I walked away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. It wasn't the peace I had hoped for all along, but it was enough. And with that, I closed the door on that chapter of my life, knowing that I had done what I could to honor my father's memory.